Hey folks, how's it going? Realm Gaming here. Today's episode, we're going to be going over week 2, just kind of how Mythic Plus is shaping up in comparison to the previous weeks. All right, so let's go ahead and take a quick look at DPS. We're going to look at DPS, tank, and healer for the high end of Mythic Plus. This is a website called Archon GG. You can go and check it out for yourself. This list does update daily, so this might be completely different if you're looking at it next week or a couple days from now. But really what we're looking to do is we're looking to make a comparison from week to week and just kind of see how the meta is shifting. So what you're looking at right now is going to be last week. We have it set to high keys, Mythic Plus, and then DPS. So high keys here just simply means the top 5% keys from the last reset. So we're going to make a direct comparison between last week, and we have another tab open up here at the top that you probably can't see. For this week, we're going to see how things have kind of shifted around. I'm going to try to make this a series, do this week to week, so we can just kind of see how the meta shifts around. I'm sure at some point things will kind of solidify and we're not going to be seeing a whole bunch of movement from week to week, so I might stop doing the series then. But for now, I think it's really interesting to see kind of some of the specs move around from week to week. Or I guess in this case, from day to day, since this list updates daily. So I'm going to be switching back and forth between tabs. You can see as I switch tabs, the only thing that's going to change here is this last week versus this week, so that way we can kind of see what's moved around. So starting with this week, we can kind of see here that Fire Mage overtook Frost Mage. If we go back and look at last week, we had Frost Mage a little bit better than Fire Mage. We do also have Shadow Priest moving up to the second spot on the list. So last week they're in third spot, so Shadow Priest did overtake both Mage specs. And then we also have Augmentation Evoker still holding strong in that number 1 spot. This is the same way last week as well. I do think personally Augmentation Evoker will fall off because you do actually lose some damage by bringing in Augmentation Evoker. So as heal checks become less and less of a concern and DPS checks become more of a concern, I do personally think Augmentation Evoker will fall a little bit in the list. Not a whole bunch, but I do think it will probably be towards the lower end of S tier towards the end of the season. And then with that being said, that kind of segues me into Destro Lock. I think these two will probably end up swapping spots as the season goes on. Again, as DPS is going to be required more and more the further you push. And, just kind of looking at Destro Lock, they're number 2 in DPS rank right now. So, they're really strong. They were actually number 1 as of like a day or two ago. So it looks like they did drop 1 spot. It'd be interesting to see what overtook them. Might be Shadow Priest. So yeah, Shadow Priest overtook them. So probably what we're going to be ending up seeing is something like Destro Lock, Shadow Priest, and Fire Mage on the very high end. You got just the high raw damage that Destro Lock brings. You got the power infusion from Shadow Priest, and then we got the combust that we can play around, and that high priority funnel damage from the Fire Mage. So that's kind of S tier. Let's go ahead and move into A tier here. So pretty surprised to see Elemental Shaman move all the way from low tier to high A tier. I said low tier, low A tier to high A tier. So if we go over here, you can kind of see Ellie Shaman. I mean, they're really strong last week as well, but they've made a ton of movement. They've gone up over almost 200 IO, and they're sitting at the top of A tier. This probably has something to do with running a Vengeance Demon Hunter right now, then bringing all that additional magic damage to the group. But this does, go to show that Ellie Shaman does do really good damage. I think they might struggle a little bit in the survivability department later on as the season goes on, but we'll just kind of see how that plays out. I hope they stay high A tier. I personally think Ellie Shaman is really fun to play. We also have Ret Pally right behind them. So we're not seeing too much movement from last week, right? We still have Devastation Evoker, Outlaw Rogue, and Ret Pally kind of in this high A tier in comparison to last week. So not a ton of movement there. But of course, you can kind of see how Ellie Shaman was low A tier and they move up to the top of A tier. One thing that was kind of surprising to see is that Balanced Druid did fall. So they were the top of A tier last week, and now they have moved to kind of the middle of A tier. Now, I'm sure as the season kind of progresses, they will, again, just kind of move up somewhere here in the top of A tier. I'm not sure exactly where, but historically, as the season progresses, Balanced Druid does get stronger and stronger as they get more and more ramp time. Now, just to kind of talk about A tier here in general, we are seeing a lot of specs that have moved into A tier from last week. So if we kind of go back here, we can see we have this huge sort of B and C tier list. If you go into this week, you can see there's a lot bigger A tier list. And then a lot have moved out of C tier as well up into B and A tier. So this is really good in my opinion. We want all specs in the game to be competing at a high level. The more specs in A tier, the better it is for the game, in my personal opinion. And basically, it looks like every single DPS spec has moved up at least one tier spot from last week, outside of like Sub Rogue, Survival Hunter, Affliction Warlock, and Assassination Rogue. Another thing that I'm kind of surprised to see is Demo locks so low in A tier. I'm not saying A tier is bad or anything, but just considering, this being like the spellcasting meta, I really thought they'd be performing in the high end of A tier. It could just be that all the good Warlock players are playing Destro at the moment. Not really sure there, but I'm sure if you took some of these good Destro players and put them down, down here playing Demo, I would assume it would bring the average up pretty significantly. So I do think Demo is still pretty strong, but it's just sort of a situation. Why would you play Demo when Destro is so much better? But yeah, I guess overall, to kind of sum this up, in terms of DPS, it's pretty much it. When comparing from this week and last week, it looks like most DPS were able to kind of move up a tier. So that's really good in my personal opinion. Let's go ahead and move on to tanks. Now, for tanks, I do think what we're seeing here is a bit of a problem, right? When you see such a huge gap between the best and the second best tank. Now, I do think this all kind of factors back into that spellcasting meta with, Vengeance Demon Hunter. They're able to bring all the interrupts. So really, you don't even need to bring a melee DPS. Typically, you bring a melee DPS because they bring a lot of interrupts. But through Vengeance Demon Hunter sigils, they can pretty much solo all the interrupts in the dungeons. So you don't need them. You don't need a melee DPS as much as you need a spellcaster. They also do bring a flat magic damage buff. So, they bring great damage. They bring great self-sustain, healing, mitigation. So when you have a tank that's this good across the board at everything, that's where you're going to see this huge gap. Now, the gap actually is growing pretty significantly, right? We can see a 200 IO gap between Prot Pally and Vengeance Demon Hunter. Compared to last week, there's only about a 100 IO gap. But outside of that, I mean, pretty much everything has stayed the same. Prot Warrior and Brewmaster are kind of battling out for that last place. I personally have not healed a Prot Warrior this season, so I can't really speak to them, but Brewmaster felt pretty bad to heal. It could have just been the specific guy I was healing, not managing their stagger well. But his self-healing was really strong, but it just seemed like his mitigation was poor. Now, this is not necessarily to knock Brewmaster. I think Brewmaster is pretty strong historically, especially in the damage department. If we take a look at him right now, they are number 1 in the DPS rank in terms of all the tanks. But just kind of overall, I guess to kind of sum all this up, it looks like tanks are shaping up pretty well. Outside of Vengeance Demon Hunter, we can take a look at the IO score. There's not a huge gap between these 5 tanks. It's just that Vengeance Demon Hunter is just that much better. In fact, it's an entire 2 tiers better than the next tank. All right, then for healer, we do have a little bit of movement here. We have Holy Pally pretty much solidifying its spot as the lowest tier healer at the moment. We got Preservation Evoker that has moved up into the B tier, and then Resto Shaman with a huge move towards A tier here. So if we kind of compare this to last week, right, we can see Resto Shaman down here in C tier, and it's moved all the way up to A tier this week. So that's really nice to see. I think personally it's really interesting to see Disc Priest so low in this list. Not to say that B tier is bad or anything, but they've been so strong for so long. It's weird to see Holy this high up. Now, I am glad for Holy Priest. They've really needed the buffs that they received at the end of Season 3. So I'm glad to see that those changes, are doing the class well right now. Then kind of like we were saying earlier, Preservation Evoker did move up into B tier. In comparison to last week, they were the lowest tier healer. So nice to see that they have kind of moved up a few spots. And then, yeah, it looks like Resto Druid is just top healer still. No surprises there. Then as far as Mistweaver monks go, I will say in terms of like the top 100 runs on Radar.io, I've not seen as many Mistweaver monks as I've seen like Holy Priest. So this is the top 5% of runs, but I would assume at the top like 1% or maybe even higher than that, this A tier probably does change slightly. Probably Holy Priest does get a slight bump over Mistweaver monk. That's just going based off the top 100 page on Radar.io for today and what I've been seeing personally. But yeah, I guess to sum all this up, biggest movement is going to be Restoration Shaman coming all the way from C to low A tier, and then Holy Priest going from low B to mid A tier. And I guess there's a case to be made for Preservation Evoker as well, going from low C to low B. Outside of that, there's really been no movement outside of these 3 specs here. But yeah, that's pretty much going to be it for this video. Might keep this up as a series. I think it's very interesting to see this as an aggregate score coming from Radar.io. I think Archon's a really cool website. I'd like to check out more of the site. This is my first couple of weeks of using it. I'm sure a lot of other people watching this right now have been using Archon for a very long time, but it's new to me. I think it's really cool to be able to see tier list in terms of this aggregate score. All right, guys, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. We'll see you on the next one.